hard things are going to happen. You need to mentally prepare yourself for the roller coaster. Okay, we had like a month and a half left and things were going to kind of crumble. I've seen a lot of companies kind of come and then they're falling behind and they're failing because they're not innovating fast enough. And a lot of that is because I think for any business or person that wants to start a business, the scariest thing is I think it's shifted over time. I think that a big thing for me has never been necessarily about just building a business. It's about trying to make an impact. And throughout the journey of Specno, we've tried to see what the different impacts we can make on, I guess, the local economy is and on the global economy. And I think our ambition has always been to be a global player. Right now, we want to be the best digital innovation agency in the world. And I think it's that ambition that's like, okay, a company from South Africa can make such a big impact and has the dreams and aspirations to be the best in the world. It's a very big driving factor for us. But I think we also needed to kind of push back and see, why do we want to be the best in the world and what difference do we want to create? And I think that we realized that in a space where the digital revolution is here and companies need to kind of adopt new technologies or they're going to fall behind, there's this massive layer of support that's really needed. And at the end of the day, we want to be that supporting layer, the foundation, building blocks of digital innovation for businesses that don't really understand tech. I feel like that's going to be our way of contributing to a lot of businesses moving into the digital revolution. And I think for me personally, it's been a big factor of seeing like, okay, I've seen a lot of companies kind of come and then they're falling behind and they're failing because they're not innovating fast enough. And a lot of that is because they don't have the technical expertise to understand how to build meaningful, long-lasting systems. So from our side, and for me personally, it's been a case of how can I actually provide that support to businesses? People have worked their lives in a lot of hours to build a business, and now they're starting to fall behind because they don't have that support. And we want to be that support layer between, I guess, founders that have built successful traditional businesses to being able to turn those traditional businesses into a digital revolution. For me, my dad was an entrepreneur. He went through a journey of shifting and changing. He was in traditional business initially just as an employee. Then he started his own business that didn't do too well, and then moved into a sign business that started doing really well. And unfortunately, the realities of the stresses of the city and the things that happen in that space, I was in Joburg at the time, caused him to want to sell that business and buy a farm. So then from, I guess, running a bigger business, or I guess just a more traditional type of business in Joburg, he went to running a business as a farm, and understanding kind of and watching him tackle different challenges as they came up, learning new things, really inspired me in the fact that I was like, okay, it's actually exciting to look at life as like a game. We're looking at spaces where it's like, okay, new challenges come up. How you learn those challenges is kind of giving you that experience points to kind of move to the next level. And understanding how to play that properly is what's going to allow you to be successful. So as a kid, I always kind of was inspired to be like a billionaire. I looked up to Richard Branson. Now, the likes of Elon Musk, not necessarily his character, but just what he's achieved. And looking at the impact that those people have made on the world also kind of really resonated to me. So it was a case of, I wanted to be the best at the game, which kind of meant, okay, billionaires are the best at the game. But I think as life has gone on, that kind of thought has kind of started to shift a little bit lower on the priority list compared to the thought of making an impact. And I think throughout my childhood, school, and varsity, it's something that I often spoke about. And because I spoke about it so often, a lot of the friends around me started to become people that also had similar ambitions. And it's kind of where I met Daniel, my co-founder. At varsity in first year we met, and we really started to become better friends in third year when we started spending more time together, speaking about what we wanted to create one day, both of us really wanting to run a business. And at that point it was focused around, I want to run a business, but I don't really know what the idea is behind the impact that I want to create. And I think for any business or person that wants to start a business, I think there's a lot of people, entrepreneurs that want to start a business. The scariest thing is, what am I going to build? We actually had a discussion in the office the other day where a few people were saying, I want to start my own business, but what do I do? What ideas are there? What problems are people facing? How do I actually solve those problems for people? And it was great to see that was kind of the basis behind what people wanted to do. It was like, I want to start a business, but let's start with what problems we can solve. And for me, it was identifying that problem. At the end of Varsity, we got a really cool opportunity that kind of spearheaded the fact that, here's an opportunity to start a business. Let me tackle that head on, see how I can, capitalize on this opportunity. And I think from there, it was kind of the journey of how do we define the value that we're trying to create from that perspective. So in my fourth year of honors, we had kind of like a coding block where we were doing software development. I was doing information systems honors here at Stellenbosch. And at the end of our first semester, we had a coding block. Daniel and I had done really well. I think we spent a lot of time. We really loved coding and the technical side of that. And from that, I think presentation that we did at the end, it was quite clear to us at least that myself and Daniel's projects were quite a bit beyond what the rest of the teams had created. And I think we had a level of confidence, but we also went out for a few drinks with the lecturers afterwards and we were like bragging a bit about it. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because that holiday, an agri-tech founder who was our lecturer's neighbor actually came to him and said like, hey, our development agency at the moment doesn't have enough capacity for us. Do you have any students that could potentially help us build out our software? And, at that point, he was like, actually, I've got two great students that you should speak to. And that was kind of our foot in the door where it was, as an opportunity, I guess us being a little bit confident and speaking about what we want to do got us to a space where the lecturer felt confident enough to say that, hey, let me make an introduction. And I think from that introduction was kind of where we had to take things further. I think our first client was really nice in the fact that it was a 3-year contract. It was quite a decent amount per month, which allowed us to hire our first 6 employees. So for the first year, we mainly focused just on that client until we got to a point where we were like, okay, we're basically at break even now. We need to start finding new clients. And at this point, we were based in Paarl, in the same office as the agri-tech client we were working on. We started engaging with quite a few of the other companies that were in the same kind of office block as we were. Just naturally we started having conversations, and there was a tech company next to us that was building software. And the founder there also didn't have as much experience in building software. So as we started engaging with her more about product, what she's trying to do, what she's trying to create, the impact she's trying to make, we also realized that there were some gaps and opportunities that she could still capitalize on. And she had this one idea of an opportunity she wanted to capitalize on to solve a problem for her current audience. But she didn't have enough capacity, and it wasn't their main focus because it was kind of a side project compared to the main system that they were building. So she then contracted us to build this side project. I think it was just luck for us in that space that it was kind of, they were there and we were engaging with them and kind of were able to explain the value we were trying to create. And I think from there it was again a space of us just being open and communicating and telling everybody what we were doing and the impact we were trying to create. And then COVID happened. Our agri-tech client told us that their funding fell through, so they could only pay us a third of what they had, what they were paying us. And that other client had finished. It was a 3-month project. We finished that, but that 3 months had given us kind of enough runway to have 2 months of runway until the company was going to have to shut down. I think at that point we really started being like, okay, we need to start doing sales. So we really bolstered up our website. We started reaching out to anybody and everybody we knew, and we started doing a whole bunch of things that weren't necessarily in the skill set that we were focused on. We were trying to do website designs, building websites, we were doing social media designs, and anything that would pay. So yeah, just the hard hustle to kind of get through that tough point. And then from there, we kind of really started focusing on kind of our digital presence. So our LinkedIn, our website, any other areas that we could find kind of referrals where people could actually find us. And then we were lucky enough, after the first month, we'd made some small income from the little things we were doing, but still quite close to the fact that, okay, we had like a month and a half left and things were going to kind of crumble. And then a US client reached out to us and said they need a full-time developer. So we kind of engaged with them, we managed to sell a full-time developer, and that kind of said like, okay, our reserve funds are now taking us to 6 months. After 1 month of having that person, they were really impressed with what we could do, so they took 2 developers, and then they kind of had a deadline to hit before April. No, not April, sorry, it was August, because that was kind of back to school for them. And they then wanted 3 developers up until that point. So we kind of went from 6 months of runway to them taking 2 developers, which means we were profitable, to them taking 3 developers, which means we were actually really profitable at this point. And because we had that hustle of looking for new clients and the digital presence we started to create, we started to engage with quite a few leads that were coming through. And then through that process, we managed to sign on another client. That was kind of a Meditech client at that point, which really put us then in a very good position to start expanding the team again. So then we started hiring more people. So we never downsized. We never wanted to downsize or reduce people's salaries. Daniel and I took a salary cut for a few months during that period of time, just to kind of get through it. We really weren't paying ourselves much, and the people around us also weren't getting paid that much as what happens in a startup. But so we didn't want to take that away from anybody. A lot of people had given up a lot to come join us, took a big risk on it. So we kind of felt that pressure that, okay, people have taken a risk, we need to put in the work to make sure we survive. But we'd built such a strong team of leaders that everybody kind of jumped in and said, okay, how can we solve this problem? And together we came up with solutions. We figured out how we were going to get through this. And then finally, when we started seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, we all had that drive and mentality and fear of, we don't want this to happen again, so we're going to keep driving to ensure that it doesn't. And I think the digital presence that we created really made a very big impact for us. Our organic leads has always far succeeded the, paid leads that have come through. So organic and referrals, I think, is a big one for us. Ensuring that our current clients are happy, that they would refer us to somebody else, or they want more work, as well as then the relationships that we were building with individuals around us, and then the content that we were putting out and the digital presence we were creating. But yeah, I think once we got to that point at the end of the year, that digital, or the agronomy company, agri company, also raised their funding that they needed. So everything went back to normal again from that perspective. So, 6 months down the line, when we thought everything was dire, we were in a really great place, and really started to push growth. So going from beginning of the year thinking we were going to fail to growing 250% in that year was... I think the biggest thing is that hard things are going to happen, and that you need to mentally prepare yourself for the roller coaster of the ups and downs, but also being able to build a really strong team around you and not try to deal with the things on your own was a very important lesson for me. It was a case of very quickly you feel like it's your responsibility, so you need to figure this out on your own. But the reality is, if you've built a really good team, they're all going to be willing to jump in and help you solve it. So being transparent about the fact of the situation we were in, instead of hiding it and bearing that weight on your own. We learned very early on to be transparent, let people know. We've got 2 months left. What are we going to do? These are some of the ideas we have. What are some of the ideas you have? Who can jump in? Does anybody know anybody that could potentially or who needs work? And at that point, anything would go. So it was like, tech stacks we didn't know, or website designs, or social media designs, anything we could do. And a lot of people really stepped up. And I very quickly realized that if you create urgency and openness with the rest of your team, the ideas that's going to come from the collective is much better than the ideas of an individual. And I think as a team, we learned through that process that in any hard time, you're going to have to put in the work to succeed. And I think that the moment you give up and you don't put in the effort is where you're probably going to fail. At the end of the day, still to this day, when something gets tough, my mind isn't like, this is dire, like, what are we going to do? Things are going to fail. It's a case of, all right, switch from like general mode of kind of growth and pushing forward to like hardcore mode, all in, working as hard as you possibly can to solve the problem at hand and really pushing through. I think it's that switch of mindset where you're like, okay, if there's a problem, all hands on deck. We're going to have to work really hard over the next few months to solve this issue. And realizing that throughout the process of building the company, we've had that a few times. And bringing the team in and everybody really working hard to solve those issues is what's always allowed us to come out on the other end. So I think for us, that's always been a big focus on finding the right characters and not necessarily the skill sets. You need to understand from a leadership perspective who are going to be the leaders and stepping up when times get tough. So it was always important for us to understand, like, okay, what type of characteristics are we looking for in people? What kind of ownership are we looking for in people? And I think this is also where we started to define a lot of our values of what we were trying to achieve in Specno, and trying to look for those values in individuals before just looking at the skill set. We were a company that was started straight out of university. Our average age at that point was like 22 years old. Even though we were like 6 or 7 people, everybody was young. So the reality is we didn't have skills. We had character. So, I think going through some of the tough times, we realized that it's the character that helps drive through that, because nobody has the skill set to deal with that specific problem 90% of the time. And I always like to tell people in business, everybody looks at somebody that's successful and they're like, that guy knows what he's doing, or that girl knows what they're doing. They're successful. This is awesome. But the reality is, when you speak to a founder, like, nobody knows what they're doing. They're figuring things out. Everybody's dealing with new challenges that they've never dealt with before. And the reality is whoever's willing to work hard enough to figure out what the solution to that problem is, and the people that are willing to fail and learn from those failures and then move on, is what's going to make the difference. So that's a lot of what we look for in individuals, is who do we think is going to be able to deal with the pressure? Who do we think is going to take the ownership? Courageously ambitious is one of our values. And at the end of the day, a lot of that stems to the fact of, we don't just want somebody to be ambitious. We want people to have courage in the fact that they're willing to take on larger challenges that they don't have the expertise to actually succeed in. And being willing to take on the risk that failure is an option, right? And I think too often we get scared of jumping into a new challenge because we're afraid of the failure. And as a company, our goal has always been to give people context and support to not fail, but give them the opportunities that are beyond their current skill level. But often we ourselves won't have the context or support to actually ensure that that thing is successful. It's new frontiers for us. It's new frontiers for the individual that's working on it. And we want people to be courageous enough to actually step up and take on the challenge that's lying ahead, and be okay with the fact that the chances of success isn't highly likely, but as long as we fail fast, we learn from those failures, and then we improve, we will be better than the rest. And it's always been our goal. And I think a mission for every individual is, all right, these are huge challenges that we're facing. We often have failures, and we try to do like retrospectives at the end of each failure to say, okay, what did we learn? And what worked, what didn't work? And how can we use the lessons about what is working and what's not working to kind of dictate what the next step is going to be in the journey. And that's always been a big thing for us, is, we need to find people that are willing to do that. So I think that's where another one of our values comes in, actually, is what we refer to as extreme ownership. There is a book about it. It's actually a really good book. But at the end of the day, if we have to hold people responsible, I think we're failing as leaders to build in that extreme ownership into people. At the end of the day, if they're taking on an opportunity, they should feel that it's their responsibility and ownership to own the success of that opportunity. And if something goes wrong, they need to identify that, not blame fit or like throw blames at anybody else, but actually consider what went wrong, what could I have done better in this situation, And if everybody's considering what they could have done better in the situation, there's a lot more ideas coming out. It's a lot more collaborative, and it's a much better way of framing what the new plan is going to be, in ensuring that this doesn't happen again moving forward. Everybody has buy-in, and we kind of move towards that space. And I think it's, as you said, it's a challenging thing, because at the end of the day, it is your baby. And you need to understand is like, how do you transfer that ownership to other individuals in the company itself? And for us, it's been a case of like, how can we find people that want to build behind the mission that we're creating? You know, they want to work with the individuals that are around them, but they're not just letting me down as the founder when they're doing something wrong, but they're letting the team around them down, you know, and they're letting themselves down. And I think the moment you give people bigger opportunities, they will really want that. And when you're finding high performers that really want to push beyond the boundaries of kind of your general career progression, you'll really find that hunger kind of sits there. And it's like, you know what, I want to be better than the rest. To be better than the rest, I'm going to have to take these new opportunities kind of by the head and kind of move forward. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think it's been a difficult journey in the initial stages. And I think it's very easy to identify when people don't have that kind of extreme ownership. And it's something that the teams often bring up to me. You know, it's like we've created individual teams that kind of work in their own business units, and they all have their own goals and functions. You know, and I find that I always feel very proud about the teams that we've built when other team members come to me and say that, you know what, somebody's not bringing their part, this person's not taking ownership, this person's bringing the quality of the team down. Because it also shows that they themselves have taken ownership in ensuring that the team is successful. You know, and it's bringing that mindset into the individuals, that it's not just about you, it's about your team and everybody around you. And when everybody around you is expecting to, like you're expecting everybody around you to perform at a high level, they're going to expect you to perform at a high level. And the moment you don't, the teams will actually bring that up. And I think that's about creating that high performance culture. Again, that's been a journey through the life. I always told people that, you know, we've failed a lot. And even though people can look at us and be like, oh, you know, Specno is quite successful, they've grown so incredibly, a lot of our growth has been based off of our failures and the learnings we've had from that. And the ability to actually accept that we're going to fail and learn from it has been kind of a very big strength of us and has bolstered our growth a lot. And not being proud in the fact that, oh, we were always right, because nobody's going to be right all the time. And so we started off with kind of the technical knowledge. So it was a understanding that a lot of individuals or companies and founders kind of understand that they're trying to solve a problem, but the technical solution that they've come up with isn't actually solving the problem. It's just a technical solution, but they lack the technical expertise and the product knowledge to actually come up with a really good product at the end of the day. So we wanted to bridge that gap in being that, okay, we want to build really high quality systems, which is the software development side, as well as bridge that product gap to say that, okay, we want to ensure that we can extract the information from the individuals more around the problem they're trying to solve and how we're going to solve that. And instead of taking their solution together, we come up with a solution for them. And, you know, it's kind of using our expertise, like jointly with the kind of understanding of the problem they're trying to solve, and creating the best system possible. And, you know, we started creating like really like meaningful systems that could make an impact, but we also started to realize that the immersive design of that also started to play a big impact, or like a big part of the success of a product. So it wasn't just, okay, we're really understanding the problem we're solving and we can build really good tech to solve that problem effectively. It was the case of, you know, there are millions of apps out there and we're all fighting for people's attention, and people know how specific things work. You know, certain people don't want to adopt new technology. You know, so how are you designing systems that's going to delight users and at the end of the day most effectively get them to complete the end task that you need them to complete, that they can see value? You know, and from a digital perspective, anybody when they have that aha moment, or, you know what, this was a really good experience for me, is what's going to bring them back. And the faster you can get them to that point, you know, the more attention you're actually going to have in a system. And it's similar to like Uber Eats. You know, if you look at that, the goal at that is to make an order and get your food delivered to you as seamlessly as possible. And they make it very easy to find what you're looking for as quickly as possible. Ordering something is very simple and quick. It's like 4 or 5 taps of a button and your food's there. And at the end of the day, that's to them was like, what is the user journey to get somebody to order as quickly as possible? Because once they do that, they're going to realize, that was super efficient and easy. I'm going to do this again. So at that point, we started to bring design in. So we started creating our whole creative division, which is like the UX UI design side of things. So at this point, we had kind of product design and software development. And I think those are the key areas that we still focus on. Our product ownership is starting to shift a little bit more towards product consulting at this point, which is when people consider you the product owner, they're expecting you to make a lot of the decisions and understanding of what it is around the product and what you want to build. But the reality is that we don't have enough insights to be able to own what the product is when we're jumping freshly onto a project. But what we do have is the experience of understanding what questions to ask, how to make people think about the solutions they're doing. Is this correct? Is it not correct? What is the business value they're trying to create? And not just from a business perspective, but also a user perspective, is what is the value you're trying to create for the users, and what's the easiest way we can create that value as quickly as possible. So now we've kind of gotten to a point where we're going into businesses, we're trying to understand the business that they're in, we're trying to understand their customers, and we're kind of really trying to dig deeper with the person that's owning this product around what is the most value we can create, whilst taking into consideration all the technical expertise we know about building the best systems. And then it goes through the whole process of building or designing the immersive experiences that are going to delight users, to building high quality systems where people are going to be happy at the end of the day as well, because it's not an overly buggy system. It works well. The design accuracy is pretty high on what the end product actually looks like. I think the biggest one is over complicating the MVP, so the minimum viable product. Like I've spoken a lot about solving a problem, but often people come up with a solution first and then they try to push a problem into it, or they've identified a problem, but they think the only way to solve this problem is via solving 30 problems through a system. But I think the reality is that you need to get people to understand that you need to look at building a new business, especially in the tech space, as like a research assignment almost. You need to create an hypothesis. Does this problem exist firstly, and are people willing to use a system to solve it? And then thirdly, depending on your monetization, are people willing to pay for this software, or are advertisers willing to pay to reach this audience? And your first thing is like, okay, well, let's get 100 people to respond to this that aren't necessarily just friends and family. So go out, do surveys. If you can prove that, yes, this does exist, you've proven your hypothesis to be true, then you move to the next stage of validation, which is creating the your kind of proof of concept. So then you need to build the most simple kind of system possible to solve that for those first 100 people or the first 1,000 people. And the reality is you don't need to do a massive system that's going to kind of delight the larger audience. At this point, you're just trying to get to the next 1,000. That's your next goal, is to like, okay, this is what I need to validate. And then beyond that, you start validating the next thing and the next. And when you're creating, every feature you build in a system is a hypothesis that this feature is actually going to create value to the user. And the more you do, the more features you add, the more kind of experiments you actually need to run. And without having a user base to give you that feedback, it's very difficult to kind of assign value or prioritize what you're going to build next. And I think that's the biggest thing we've seen, is people aren't willing to actually go out and validate what they're doing. I think people are afraid, and they also often think they know better. And they're like, no, we've spoken to people, they're not going to switch, or they're not going to use this unless it has all these features. And the reality is as well, have you built something without all those features and try to sell it to them or not? But people just push back and say like, no, I don't want to do that, because I think the biggest thing is fear of failure. So they're like, no, if I do that and people don't like it or they don't purchase it, then it's going to be seen as a failure, and they take it personally. So I think people want to build and build and build until they're like, this is a perfect massive product that's going to solve everybody's problems. And then, at the end of the day, when they launch it, it's too complicated. It's not what people actually want. And the reality is you can't figure out if it is actually what people want until you give them a system to engage with. It's like asking a question on a survey is very different to seeing how somebody actually engages with a product and the feedback they can give you once they've actually engaged with it. And a lot of people also don't want to do free trials or get some of the initial people on for free. So it's a case of, are you willing to actually go out and give people like the system for free to give you feedback initially? And if you can get that out earlier, it's definitely possible. The first thing that we'll do is to really understand if somebody's validated their idea or not. And if they haven't validated it, we'll try go through a process of what we call concept validation. And that's all around understanding the problem, the business model, and the tech feasibility around it. And is it going to be a possibility for us to build this system, and is it going to be successful? And defining what an MVP is going to look like. And then there's a second step to that, which is like, okay, if they've already validated it, how do we now again define the MVP and scope out what the system is actually going to look like? And from that perspective, we really try get out in front of users, try get feedback, try starting to build an audience initially to see, can we get 100 people on a WhatsApp group or something like that we can ask questions to that are going to be your early adopters or not. Again, a lot of that isn't always up to us to ensure that that's theirs. We give the information and the insights, and the clients need to go out and actually do that. We're there to provide the process and facilitate the journey. And a lot of that responsibility kind of gets pushed back onto the client, because it's also really important for them to understand who their users are, what they want, so that they can really make the end decisions on what they want to build. And once we have a really good understanding of what that MVP is going to look like, is when we then move into the next stage, which is the design area, which is translating those ideas into designs, which has also been extremely important to understand the business value we're trying to create and the end objectives. Who is the user that's going to use this? What is the archetype? What is the end goal? How are we going to get them to that wow factor as quickly as possible, and how are we going to achieve the business goals throughout the design as well? And then from there, once we've kind of done those designs, we'll go through some user testing, actually see how are users engaging with this design. And there are simple apps and stuff where you can create prototypes. People can click through it, ask them, what are they thinking? Ask them to edit something. Can they find the edit button, or how to add a task to something? And then from there, we go into the development phase. And again, we try to develop as little as possible to launch as quickly as possible. And then from there, kind of build features on. And once people kind of start to engage with the system, they can give you more feedback. As well as often the roadmap shifts and changes to realize actually, something else that can add a lot more value. And I think that's the general process we go through. I'm not sure if you'd like me to speak about an example of the actual client that went through that. So the timelines often depend on the size of the project itself. So we try go through the validation phase, is a 6 to 8 week process. It also depends on how available the client is and their willingness to actually go out and get the information back. A lot of the validation is around getting user feedback and engaging with the kind of audience that you want to solve a problem for. And that does unfortunately take time. So it's really trying to get as much information in a short period of time as possible. Then we go into the design phase, which is usually around 6 weeks. And through that 6 weeks, there's a lot of iterations where kind of have low fidelity wireframes that go out just to understand the flow of the system. Then we go into high fidelity, and then we go into kind of what we call a UI rollout, which is kind of where you're adding the brand colors, what the brand's going to look like, the emotions we're trying to kind of elicit from the users. And then, we kind of usually present a few options of what you would like. The clients will then usually go through and say, I like a little bit of that one, a little bit of this one, and then we kind of mix and match and create the final design of what the client really wants. And then we kind of roll out what the interface is going to look like over the specific wireframes, which is basically just, again, a flow diagram of what all the screens and things would look like. And then, from there, because we actually have design and development all in under one roof, we put a massive emphasis on designing for development. And And people will be surprised at how much time you can save in development if the designers actually understand what takes long to develop and not. Designers can get carried away in like designing these beautiful screens or a nav bar that's got like a floating button. When you click it, it expands into 10 different things, and there's these water drop things that pop up. And the reality is like when you build that, it's the difference between having that or, let's say, a nav bar that looks like YouTube or Facebook. It's just a simple bar with items that you click on, and that simple bar could take you like 2 to 3 hours to develop, or it's going to take you like a week and a half to develop the fancy floating icons and stuff. And I think it's such an important factor that people often overlook, is that design is so closely coupled to development and understanding what is possible, and how do you design something beautiful and immersive within the boundaries of what can be developed quickly. And I think for us, often like building new products, that rapid development and getting things out quickly is like really vital, but we also know how vital the design element of that is. So we then focus on coupling those together really nicely. So designers will then create a very nice like developer handover document with like all the specifications, so that when it goes into development, it's a much smoother process. And then development, again, it depends, but it can go between like 3 months to 12 months to get an MVP out. We try push for 3 months, but some systems are just really complex, and even the minimum features of that complex system does take like 9 to 12 months to build. So from the startup's perspective, we've seen really good growth in certain areas and understanding the feedback that comes from kind of the general users and the impact that comes from it. So new apps launching are always challenging to understand what the exact KPIs are you're trying to improve, because it's just new KPIs and new kind of data that's coming in. I think the big space where you see improvement is when you look at some of the larger businesses where we're redesigning or rebuilding some of their tools. So I'm not sure if I can give you the exact stats for certain things, but there was one of our clients came in and they needed to do a redesign on their onboarding flow of their system, because they saw a lot of clients were onboarding and then they were really happy with the system, and then after the onboarding phase, when they actually started engaging with the system themselves, so the demo account fell away, there was massive drop-offs. People weren't actually using the system anymore. They didn't understand how to do things. Things were way too complicated. And the reality is that onboarding experience was created in a way that there was a kind of built scenario, and they were taking you through all the pre-built kind of scenarios and data in the system. It's like, okay, when you get to this point, click here, you can edit this or add this. And then when they got into the system and they saw a pre-built scenario, they found themselves very comfortable and they could use the system, they could edit it. But the moment they went onto their personal profile and they had to start from scratch to put in new data, they realized that, okay, I actually don't know how to do the initial setup. Like, how do I create this? Like, where do I find the starting point for this? And because of that, it was like massive customer like engagement and like high happiness levels at like the end of onboarding, and then massive drop off after that. So we then helped them create a more immersive onboarding experience that was helping people set up their initial data, so that when they kind of started and they were past the demo phase, they weren't starting from scratch, but they were already filling in their own data to get to that point. We shortened the steps massively as well, explained a lot of the initial areas that users were struggling with. So we did a lot of user testing, user interviews to see, where were users actually struggling with the post kind of demo phase. And we started from there. It's like, okay, how do we create this data, show users how to use the system effectively? And we've already seen a massive increase in retention after that, because, again, as I said, users were happy with the value it could add, but then when they actually had to start using the system, they didn't know how to. And that caused a large drop off. So now the retention after that and the utilization is way up. So again, that will be different for our business clients to startups. So business clients usually have an audience, so it's very easy for them to get the information and the advertising out to their audience to kind of adopt a new system. But it's a very different thing when you don't have the audience or the money to get to the audience itself. So that's why throughout the process, we always try and encourage founders to actually go through the process of trying to get 100 people initially to kind of give you feedback. And, once you get to the point where you're launching the system, you then ask those 100 people to refer, 2 or 3 people each that you think you could reach out to that are having similar problems. And you build the audience organically like that. Because the reality is conversion rates on advertising and things like that are very low and very costly for new startups if they don't have money to do that. But also a lot of people think that, I'm going to launch my app and I'm going to get 1,000 people in the first 2 weeks, not realizing the actual customer support nightmare that comes with onboarding 1,000 new people that haven't used the system, and the queries that are going to come through, and not a good way of actually managing that and resolving the issues, which is going to cause a lot more negative sentiments than the positive if you're actually solving the issue. So I say rather start slower initially and try to understand exactly what customers want, what they're struggling with, what they're not struggling with. And then either you can update the system to manage that a little bit better, or you can create internal processes to manage that better. But the reality is that you don't want to jump into thousands of people in day one if you're not used to dealing with that. But also the manual approach to trying to just put in the effort to engage personally with people has definitely been the one that yielded the most results. I think if you don't adapt and actually use the AI no-code tools, it does cause a lot of issues. So we've always wanted to be at the forefront of technology. And because of that, every time new tools come out, we adapt to that. So we actually have a low-code division that focuses on no to low-code products. And the reality is it does speed up your development time drastically. And those technologies are evolving so quickly that in the future, there might be a space where general front-end development isn't needed anymore. But right now, it's not there. So there's a lot of complex things that it can't do and it can't solve for you yet. But as I said, those technologies are rapidly improving. So seeing how we can always stay ahead and also add more value to our clients. So at the end of the day, our clients pay for time. So using low-code development is something that we would use if it is feasible. So whenever there's a feasibility that's like, okay, we can do this in low-code, we'll always go low-code because we know we can do it like in a third of the time. And we can deliver the same value in a third of the time, which means much higher value for our clients. But the reality is that isn't always the case. And then from an AI perspective, we've massively started to adopt that internally. So a lot of our teams are actually using AI, whether it be to actually help them code or help them solve specific problems, whether it's from an operational perspective, how to manage certain things, get ideas out, how to conceptualize certain ideas. The teams internally are using it drastically, and we are now starting to look at how we start providing this as a service to other individuals. Like, how do we incorporate AI into some of the systems we're building? And we do have a system now where we'll have to use some like image generative AI for some of the features of the system. And then another client that we're looking to do some like large language model stuff, or LLM, ChatGPT like AI features. And it's always exciting to jump into a new space like this again. And then I think this is also coming back to that courageously ambitious, is jumping into this and being able to say that we are going to add value to a client through this is scary, but we are willing to put in the work. And we found in the past that if we're willing to put in the work to make sure it's successful, we know we can add value. If there's some lessons along the way, we'll take the school fees, we'll take the hits, and then just put in the extra time to make sure we deliver value at the end of the day. One of the biggest challenges we've had was kind of transitioning between a smaller organization where it was very easy for the whole team to come together, discuss things, and be aligned to what we're trying to achieve, which also makes you a lot more adaptable and agile as an organization, to shifting to a large organization. So post 25, so our 25 to like 35 was really where we started to feel this knock was, right, you need to create communication structures and leadership structures that allow you to speak to a few individuals that can then actually disseminate that information down and ensure everybody's aligned to understand what's going on. And how do you ensure that the transparency is still there when you can't speak to every individual about what's going on? So you need to be empowering your leaders with enough information and context that they can kind of distribute that information further down. And if anybody else has questions, that can kind of filter back up to you. And also dealing with issues. I think that I always tell people that our organization has kind of a hierarchy in just being able to support individuals so that we can empower a team lead who's managing 3 or 4 people to be able to deal with some of the problems and issues that somebody in his team is facing, so that he understands how to solve that problem. He can put new processes in place and ensure that the team can be managed more effectively. If it's a problem that's too big for him to deal with, it will go up to the head of department, who will then try and manage to see, okay, do they have more experience in understanding how to deal with this problem? If they don't, then it comes all the way up to me, where I can then brainstorm and ideate on what the best solution for the problem is going to be. But the reality is when you've got 50 people, you can't listen to everybody's issues and try to solve all of them. You need to create structures where individuals have ownership to be able to do that, also without needing consistent approval for everything. So we've tried to remove that kind of approval side of things, empowering individuals, but that also comes with understanding what we're trying to achieve. Because at the end of the day, if this individual is making decisions without really understanding where we're going, they could make the wrong decisions. So it's vitally important for us to ensure they know what's going on. But from a general who can interact with who perspective, we look at it as flat. It's not a case of a junior can't come speak to me because, I'm the CEO and they're not allowed to do that. It's anybody can come speak to me. If they've got a challenge or a new exciting opportunity that they're thinking about, I always encourage anybody to come openly chat to me about it and have a general discussion. So I actually only recently took on the role of CEO, so Daniel had it before me. So one of the most important things about starting a business to me is often having a co-founder and ensuring that you have complementary skill sets. So Daniel was always much better in understanding bigger picture vision and then really good with building relationships and sales, where I've always been very strong from a financial and an operational perspective. So we kind of had our domains of expertise. And from the get-go, I think it was very important for us to realize that we had some heated debates where we argued with each other around what we thought the best approach was for something, but it was always a constructive argument where my goal here is to make sure that I can inform them enough to change their mind about something, because if it has anything to do about vision or sales, if I can't change Daniel's mind, he's going to implement what he wants to implement in any case, because I've got no say in what happens there. And similar to finance and operations is, we would have debates again on what the best approach to do certain things were, and his goal would be to change my mind and make me understand his point of view. But at the end of the day, again, I had more context and understanding of what was going on there. So, I could consume the information he was telling me. Sometimes I'd take certain parts of it and I'd be like, yes, these are really good ideas. Maybe not everything was a good idea. I would adapt that and then implement it to kind of the area that I needed to focus on. And then I think as the organization started to grow, those areas kind of split further and further apart. And we realized that they needed to be brought back together, and there needed to be a singular focus around how we manage the whole organization from a singular point. So somebody that understands the sales side, the vision, and everything else, because having the split now, I think, was causing an issue where the vision and the mission didn't always align exactly with what we were doing from an operations perspective, or the way we were selling things weren't always aligned exactly with how we were executing things from an operational perspective. So we needed to create unity. And at that point, Daniel stepped in as CEO to create more of the unity. And I carried on working on operations, but dealing a lot more with sales and marketing at this point to try operationally bring everything together. So I'd rather use vision disseminated down to me. And then I think at the point where we got now, it's the size of the organization and the mindset of what we're trying to achieve, I think my skill sets kind of suited better towards seeing okay, I'm trying to set the vision and understanding of where Specno is going, and there is a deep understanding of operations needed to really know what's going to get us to that point. So again, it's different when you're small and you're very agile. As you get larger, it's more important to understand from a bigger picture. It's okay, this is our 5-10 year goal. What do we need to start doing now in a small step process to get there? And I think it was then important to make sure that vision was kind of holistically portrayed to everybody, so that there wasn't this misperception between vision and what we're doing now, and there wasn't a nice correlation between both. And as we're growing now, Daniel's stepping up into like a group CEO role. So we've got bigger plans of what we're trying to achieve as a group company, and some new opportunities that have kind of presented themselves. So, I wanted to take over the role of CEO of Specno to see how we can get Specno to being the best digital innovation agency in the world. And Daniel's stepping in from a group perspective to see how can we build the supporting companies to actually help us get there. We're looking now at investing in some different agencies, and just complementary services or like deep tech areas where people have specific focuses in certain areas. A lot of it hasn't fully been figured out yet. We're still in the initial stages of identifying where this is going. But, I think that we've understood that there's a lot of opportunity in the market, and a group is better than an individual. And I think what we've learned from a leadership perspective is bringing the teams in to help us solve problems. I think we want to bring that to the bigger company level where we're like, okay, well, let's bring multiple businesses together to solve problems together and see how as a group we can grow and become the best. That also helps us from a scalability perspective. A company can only scale so fast, but if you have multiple companies scaling together, you can have a much bigger impact a lot faster. And personally, I also just like teaching, coaching, mentoring individuals. So trying to look at some smaller agencies that we can mentor them through some of the growth that they're going through, and also some larger agencies where we can potentially learn from them as well. The end goal overall, I guess, being the best digital innovation agency in the world is kind of the general set, okay, this is how we measure ourselves towards that. But I think the bigger goal is globally making an impact in allowing businesses to scale their digital innovation. And how do we get to a point where anybody's like, okay, I really need to implement a digital strategy that's going to be the best. I'm going to go to Specno for that. To the points where you're working with Google, you're working with Spotify, you're working with Facebook, because if they come to Specno, they're going to get 10% better conversions. They're going to get 20% better retention. At the end of the day, we want the big companies to come to us because we are the best at executing on certain elements of digital innovation. And yes, we might not be the best at helping them from their core perspective, but anything new that's coming out, they should be coming to us because we are going to be the best at that. And I think that's our goal, is how do we always be better than everybody else around us from an execution perspective? And I think a lot of that stems from, you can only make massive impact if you are doing the best quality work. And if we can deliver the best user experience with the best kind of retention, the lowest churn, the highest conversion, we can make a massive impact for those businesses that allow them to succeed. And that's from kind of small businesses to large businesses. I think it's just a goal for us to be able to look at the big companies, kind of the ones that you kind of aspire to be like, they're choosing us over anybody else because they know we're going to be the best at delivering that. Which also then shows that, everybody else we're working with, we're also creating that value. The big thing that I've always tried to get across to individuals around starting businesses and also mentoring different founders through it is understanding the process, that things like success doesn't come overnight. It's going to be a hard work, and that it's good to build a supporting network around you to be able to go through kind of a lot of these challenges. I think that a lot of people, founders, can get very lonely and stuck because their friends around them aren't necessarily going through anything similar, and you very quickly find yourself distanced from your general friends because they're speaking about kind of some general kind of problems that they're facing at work, or they're not happy, or they're busy with a specific project, but your problem's starting to become like, how am I going to pay this person's salary? We just had a client that's trying to sue me, or I'm trying to close this massive deal and I'm not sure I have the skill set to do that, or I just closed this massive deal. Do we even have the skill set to execute on it? And I think your mindset shifts so far beyond what your general peers around you are speaking about that you feel very distant and you can get lonely. And that's also where it's important to actually create a network of founders and people that have gone through similar things around you, And that's where mentorship to me comes in, is find mentors that are business owners as well, so that you kind of build that support network that when you're going through challenging times, you have somebody to speak to about it. Even if they can't solve the problem for you, just having somebody to speak to that actually understands makes such a massive impact, and has definitely helped me along the journey a lot.